Agency is defined by psychologists like Albert Bandura as the human capability to influence the course of events by one's actions. The particular dimension of agency that I've experienced is a sense that there are more aspects of the status quo that are potentially changeable as opposed to being fixed. These are the elements of the status quo that are attributable to human action or inaction as opposed to the laws of physics. Obviously, the sense of agency didn't extend to every problem under the sun. It was limited to those areas where progress could be made by getting identifiable individuals and organizations to take some action, whether it was the president signing an executive order or proposing a new budget initiative, the G20 agreeing to increase investment in a global public good, Congress passing a law, or a coalition of organizations like companies, foundations, nonprofits, and universities working together to achieve a shared goal. I had the privilege of working at the White House for both Presidents Clinton and Obama, and as a White House staffer, I had the ability to send the president a decision memo if he checked the box that said yes, and that idea actually happened and was well implemented. This reinforced my sense of agency. But it wasn't just the experience of being successful. It was also the knowledge that one acquires by repeatedly trying to move from an idea to something happening in the world. That could include working with the Congress to pass legislation that gave every agency the authority to sponsor incentive prizes for up to $50 million, including funding for dozens of national science and technology initiatives in the president's budget, such as the National Nanotechnology Initiative or the BRAIN Initiative, recruiting people to the White House to help solve hard and important problems, like reducing the waiting list for an organ transplant, allowing more foreign entrepreneurs to come to the United States, or launching a behavioral sciences unit within the federal government. And finally, using the president's bully pulpit to build coalitions of companies, nonprofits, philanthropists, universities to achieve a particular goal, like expanding opportunities for more K-12 students to excel in STEM education. I'm a big believer in Joy's law, which states that no matter who you are, most of the smartest people work for someone else. I also agree with Nobel laureate Linus Pauling's observation that the best way to have a good idea is to have a lot of ideas. So if you have the capacity to get excited about other people's ideas, you'll be exposed to more ideas, and there's a greater chance that some of them will be exceptional and worth pursuing and advocating for. Obviously, most people have not had 16 years of their professional life in which they could send a decision memo to the president, get a line in the president's State of the Union address, work with Congress to pass legislation, create a new institution, shape the federal budget, and build large coalitions with hundreds of organizations that are taking mutually reinforcing actions in the pursuit of a shared goal. So sometimes when I'm talking to an individual or team or community, it'll become clear to me that there's some aspect of the status quo that they view as fixed and I view as potentially changeable. It might make sense for me to explain why I believe the status quo is changeable, what are the steps we could take together in the service of achieving a shared goal. Obviously, changing the status quo is hard. If I don't know how to do it or believe that I would be tilting at windmills, it's not likely that I would devote a lot of time and energy to trying to do so. It may be the case that pushing for change will require a fair amount of work, like expressing my idea clearly and communicating it effectively to multiple audiences, marshaling the evidence to support it, determining who the relevant deciders are for a given idea, addressing objections or misconceptions, or responding to legitimate criticism, and finally building the coalition of people and institutions who support the idea and may be prepared to take some action to advance it. So if I want people to devote time and energy to fleshing out an idea or doing some of the work needed to make it happen, I need to convince them that something constructive could plausibly happen. And one way to do that is to describe what success might look like and discuss the actions that we would need to take in order to achieve our shared goal. As an economist might put it, I'm trying to increase their expected return of pursuing a shared goal by increasing the likelihood that my collaborators attach to our success. Let me give you an example. I'm currently working with Adam Marblestone on an idea that he and Sam Rodriguez have proposed to create focused research organizations. These are well-funded, university-adjacent research nonprofits with a very specific 5 to 10-year goal. The premise is that there's a class of important scientific and technological problems that are difficult to solve in industry because there's no short-term path to profitability, or academia because they require a level of funding in team science that's very difficult to do in a university lab. Well, scientists and engineers are not spending a lot of time thinking about what types of focused research organizations should exist because there's no entity that's currently funding them. So Adam and I had to convince people that it's plausible that there could be focused research organizations and that it's rational for them to spend some time describing how such an organization could accelerate progress in the fields and problems that they're most familiar with. One way to put it is that people generally change their ideas so that they fit within the existing landscape of policies, institutions, funding mechanisms, and incentive structures. What I'm interested in is what ideas would they generate if they thought that policies and institutions would change to accommodate their ideas as opposed to the other way around. I used to pose the following thought experiment to people. Imagine that you have a 15-minute meeting in the Oval Office with President Obama, and he says, if you give me a good idea, I will call anyone on the planet. And it can be a conference call, so there can be more than one person on the line. But you have to tell me, what's your idea, and why are you excited about it? And in order to make your idea happen, who should I call, and what should I ask them to do? The thought experiment has several goals, including expanding people's views about what's changeable, encouraging them to identify the specific coalition of the willing and able that would need to act to advance their idea, and looking for what Bucky Fuller called a trim tab, the tiny little device that moves a rudder that steers an ocean liner. It was also a way of getting them to answer the Hamming question. The late Richard Hamming used to ask his scientific colleagues at Bell Labs, what are the most important problems in your field? And what are you working on? Which would occasionally get people to confront the fact that they were working on a second or third tier problem. Presumably, if you had had a meeting with President Obama, you would have pitched him on an idea that you think is really important. Another approach is to explain some process that is opaque to them, like how the president's budget is prepared, or how the president decides what to prioritize in his State of the Union address, or how the agenda for the G7 or the G20 is set, or what actions agencies can take even in the absence of new legislation, or how a president can use his ability to convene to advance his agenda. Yes, absolutely. One is a lack of appropriate epistemic humility by pushing a proposed solution in the absence of reasonable evidence that it will work, or failing to identify unintended consequences. It's useful to read books like James Scott's Seeing Like a State to safeguard against that. I also really like the idea of evidence-based policy. For example, governments might provide modest amounts of funding for new ideas, medium-sized grants to evaluate promising approaches, and large grants to scale interventions that have been rigorously evaluated and have a high benefit-to-cost ratio. I could imagine a large-scale oral history project of former policymakers that's done not solely with the goal of informing scholarship in history and political science, but also with the goal of democratizing policy entrepreneurship. Examples of the questions that could be asked include, what did you learn at the end of your service that you wish you'd known at the beginning? How did the various processes that you were involved in, like budget, legislation, regulation, policy development, and implementation of existing policy, how did those processes work? What tools did your agency have at its disposal to solve problems? What were the range of options that were considered for the most important problems that you worked on? What determined the decisions that were ultimately made? And what problems remain that you wish you'd been able to make more progress on? If organized and synthesized, I think this information could expand the number of people that could contribute to informing public policy.